Recent books on American evangelicalism, such as Kristin DuMez's Jesus and John Wayne, have challenged long-held assumptions about the relationship between faith and politics. On this episode of Recollecting Carter, I talk with David Nanninga about how certain sets of religious beliefs worked at the local level in cities such as Waco and Amarillo, Texas, to shape public opinion and ultimately sway the 1980 presidential election.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear. The time for racial discrimination is over. That I will faithfully execute
an undiminished, ever-expanding American dream.
The office of President of the United States.
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
And will, to the best of my ability,
It is a crisis of confidence.
preserve, protect, and defend
To remove the blight of war, the threat of war, would be the overwhelming dream that I would have.
the Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
My name is David Nanninga. I'm a PhD student of history at Baylor University, and I'm studying specifically the history of the American right and its connections to politics and religion and culture broadly. And that brought me into looking at the relationship of white evangelicals in Texas to Jimmy Carter and his presidency.
There's been kind of a macro narrative about these kinds of things and approached from a lot of different angles. We've talked on the podcast to some folks in the media studies world that have looked at changes in the media, the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine during the Reagan years and the rise of Rush Limbaugh, things like that. There's been some really great books recently about the Christian music industry. God gave rock and roll to you and me and Cold War country. I know one book in particular that's been really influential and was influential on your recent work on Carter was Jesus and John Wayne. So if you want to start by giving us an overview of that book and other books that are engaging in this discourse, and then how your really specific historical work fits in that and kind of proves the hypothesis in a way, if you can use that with history.
Yeah, so Jesus and John Wayne, written by Kristin DuMez, is this new kind of almost like paradigm shifting book in the history of white evangelicalism, because it basically redefines what white evangelicals are about in a lot of ways. Previously, people had always understood them as being driven by primarily religious belief, which would make sense, right? But she argues that white evangelicals are basically more of a cultural group, particularly driven by politics, conservative politics, and an affinity for white militant masculinity is what she says. And she says you can see that being the driving force behind all of their actions within the 20th century. And how that relates to Carter specifically is that she argues that it was really Carter's failure to match their ideas of militant masculinity that led to them rejecting him in favor of Ronald Reagan and his politics. And that really was a significant moment, she would argue. And that kind of counters other narratives that we see throughout the history of looking at how did white evangelicals become basically the religious right. You have some who would argue that it was the passing of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court in 1973. Randall Ballmer is another figure who has a very strong thesis that actually it was race and basically fighting against integration. And that matches the Carter years. The IRS takes away the tax-exempt status from Bob Jones University, and that's what he argues. But DuMez's argument has been very, very strong. It has taken very, very significant hold in the historiography. And my work basically was about figuring out, okay, she has this very big, strong national narrative, right? And what I wanted to do with my research is test, okay, how do we see that play out locally? Does her argument over a large group of people, millions, Do we see that play out on the ground level? And so that's where my research into looking at white evangelicals in Texas, and even more specifically within 2 Texas cities, for Waco and Amarillo, Texas. I look into that and see, okay, do we see this affinity for militant masculinity feeding into their dislike of Carter? So that's where some of my research goes. And I also, in my research, wanted to look at some issues that were not the ones that were always at the front of Carter studies or things that people point to. So most often people would talk about abortion, or they would talk about his conference on families or issues like that. And I wanted to also see, okay, what are white evangelicals saying about other policies of his at the time? So that's where some of my research also kind of zags a little bit too.
Well, let's get into it. Why don't you talk about some of the methodology and how your methodology fits within history? It's historical research, but it's done in a way that's a little bit more social scientific than a lot of historical work, and how that methodology then propelled you to be able to say, yeah, so we have these macro discourses, these kind of theories about what happened, but here's some real evidence that we can begin to apply and see which theories are the strongest.
Yeah, absolutely. So my methodology was basically, I was going to take like a sample size of various different ways that people engaged with politics on a local level. So there were 3 big ways that I was going to look at. So one, I looked at local letters to the editor of like newspapers, which is where people will comment on the issues of the day, or in some cases they'll respond to opinion editorials that people have written, which I did look at those as well. On a small regional level, those are kind of the drivers of opinion.
Especially back in the 70s.
Of course, right? Because this is another thing that's important to understand from this era, is that while it is an era where we start to see television and national news become a thing, and that's certainly a very important piece in the Carter years when it comes to the hostage crisis in Iran. But most people in the late 70s are still getting their news from local newspapers. That's where the vast majority of their news is coming. Circulation numbers for those newspapers are pretty large too, which is another thing that I use to support my argument. So I'm looking at letters to the editor, local opinion editorials. And then the last major thing that I looked at that was very helpful was constituent letters to their congressmen. At Baylor University, there are collections of all these former U.S. congressmen who went to Baylor. They donated their papers to the Pogue Legislative Library is the name of it. And within that library, in their papers, they have all of these letters that constituents wrote to them about different issues. One of the ways that I was able to, first of all, see what mattered to people is just look at how many letters there are on a given topic, right? More letters there were, clearly there was more of a discourse, there was more passion behind this. So that already is a thing that we can gauge. And then also just looking at and calculating, okay, how many people are supporting Carter, how many were against, and then also what was some of the language that they used, like what rhetoric were they using? And so that was the last major thing in terms of outcomes, is looking at how did they vote in the 1976 election versus the 1980 election. The 1980 election, of course, concludes this, and we do see a very significant shift in both of these cities against Carter. Basically, I'm pulling from a bunch of different threads to point at these specific changes, looking at rhetoric, looking at sample size, and all of those combined, I argue that you can make some pretty clear inferences and arguments over what was driving the politics when it came to Carter for these folks. After looking at all these sources, I was able to piece all of them together and then make an argument about what was driving the politics for these white evangelicals in Waco and Amarillo.
I'm really interested to get into the inferences, but, as a historian myself, I'm also interested in the individual pieces of evidence. So as you were getting into these primary sources in newspapers and letters and things like that, what were some of the responses that really stood out to you?
There was several that stood out, and the ones that stood out because of how really impassioned they were. So one of the issues, I'll give you an example that I looked at, was white evangelical reactions to Carter's pardoning of the draft evaders of the Vietnam War. just like the very first thing he does in office. It's this very symbolic thing that was an issue in his campaign. And in Waco and Amarillo, almost all the reaction was overwhelmingly negative. I found newspaper accounts of the local VFW flying their flag upside down and lowering it to half staff, which is like this sign of distress. In the constituent letters, there was so much use of two words in particularly that really stuck out: disgust and disgrace. People talking about how disgusted they were, how much of a disgrace this was. Also using words like traitor and coward to both describe the draft debaters themselves, and then in some cases, even Carter himself, right? So within all of that, we see that there is a strong, like, gendered thing happening. This is where DuMez's thesis of militant masculinity is, we see that play out, right? Where because Carter is offering forgiveness to these draft debaters who did not fight in this military conflict, he was stepping outside the bounds of what was acceptable and what was needed in a strong leader. So we see that sort of rhetoric. And then the other way that I think we really see what drives white evangelicals' politics when it came to Carter is in writing against the Equal Rights Amendment, because this is the other big issue where we see gender play such a big role. And the sources that stuck out by far the most to me were these letters that were written to local congressmen by teenage girls talking about how they did not support the Equal Rights Amendment, how Carter's support of the Equal Rights Amendment was actually dangerous to them, and that it also would attack men. One girl used the term, it would cut down on men's macho, right? We see all in that this really strong emphasis on traditional gender roles. And we see that driving their politics. And we see that also coming from a place of religious belief. Like the girl that I just mentioned in her letter, she also talked about how men and women are supposed to act this way because it says so in the Bible. All of this is driving disdain for Carter. It starts almost at the very beginning of his presidency with the draft debater pardon, and it kind of carries throughout. And so much of it comes from this place of Carter is not the strong male president that we want him to be. He is not like the John Wayne-esque figure, as DuMez would argue. He is a guy who is emphasizing human rights and diplomacy, and also is wearing a sweater in a presidential address. All of that rubs white evangelicals in Waco and Amarillo the wrong way and lead them to vote against him in 1980, whereas previously they had voted for him in 1976. And that helped swing the state to Reagan in 1980.
It's certainly one of the great paradoxes of Carter's presidency that, to whatever degree you could quantify being a quote unquote Christian president, it's really hard to argue that Carter isn't the most Christian president we've ever had. Yet his popularity was tenuous at best with Christians in 1976 when he got elected, and then quickly eroded. So talk a little bit more about some of the macro inferences that we can make extrapolating data from places like Waco and Amarillo, Texas, and maybe where you see your work going as you continue.
I think some of the inferences that we can make here are that this affinity for militant masculinity that DuMez talks about, that's not just reserved to evangelical elites. It's not just your Criswell in First Baptist Dallas or your Jerry Falwells. I mean, these are the figures that historians will point to. And a critique that can be made is like, well, you're talking about a small number of elite figures. Is this really playing out on the ground? And after looking at what I looked at, I would argue yes. Certainly, we see this sort of rhetoric in places that were very evangelical. That's one of the things I do is also like just look at broad survey data. How many people are white? How many people go to evangelical denominational churches? And it's a lot of them. And we see this rhetoric there. So we can infer that. However, another thing that is important that I think we need to recognize is that there are local specificities that are still going to be there. One of the things about Amarillo that came up in my research that is pretty significant is that Amarillo is basically since the beginning of the Cold War, had been a hotbed for pretty extreme right-wing agitation. In the early 1960s, the mayor of Amarillo was a member of the John Birch Society. And there was this scare within the city about their local clergy being infiltrated by communism because they were part of the National Council of Churches. And there was a call for a boycott of weekly tithing to churches until they disavowed them. And there were books taken off shelves in public schools, which of course is very, reminiscent of today in a lot of ways, unfortunately. So Amarillo was already kind of a specific case study because of the John Birch Society history there. And that's important because that played a part certainly in the last topic that I looked at, which was Carter's negotiations of SALT II with the Soviet Union. There were John Birch Society speakers in Amarillo arguing that Carter was selling out the United States to the Soviet Union. And that drove some opposition to that issue in Amarillo. And so local instances like that are still very important when we look at these narratives. Where do you need to split the hairs with the local instances and local realities, which are important? And in what places can you lump things together and say, actually, this is true here as well? And I do think you can say on a broad level that DuMez's thesis is correct, at least when it comes to these two localities. So I kind of hope that this provides a little bit of a model for how to look at these big overarching narratives about Carter and evangelicals on a local level. Because ultimately, what you have is thousands of case studies like this that have yet to be done. And that's an important, missing aspect of this. What led white evangelicals in, say, Oklahoma City or other regional cities like that to embrace Carter or reject him? Those are questions we haven't necessarily answered in the historiography yet. So I'm kind of hoping that my work can say, hey, we can test these different theories on a local level and add to this bigger tapestry of this shift in history.
So to wrap up, I'd like to hear what you think the present day application of this kind of work is. Of course, we can do more work and understand history better, but how does this study help us to understand where we are currently in American politics, in American evangelical life, and American culture more generally? Maybe, if we're really optimistic, can it help us to chart a better path forward?
I think it is honestly essential to look at this particular period when it comes to trying to figure out how we got here, when it comes to white evangelicals' almost undying support for the Republican Party and for Donald Trump. Tracking that is going to help us make sense of where we are today. And will also help us understand, okay, what are the driving motivations behind their support for this figure who, to be frank, a lot of us were very confused and horrified as to why there was this support for him. By looking back in the past, we can see there were things that should have pointed us to this. And that also means that a different path can be charted moving forward. That's where some of this work is really important because it helps us understand the local level and also the people in the pews, what drives them, what motivates them on a specific level where we're not making generalizations. And that I think is very important. Ultimately, all individuals have specific motivations within themselves as to why they believe what they believe, why they vote the way they vote. And this work helps us understand that in the past, and we can then understand how to move forward in the future with that too. So that's where I think a lot of this is really necessary, particularly in an election year and moving forward, to understand which way is the evangelical church going to go when it comes to what is driving their politics. By understanding the past, we can kind of understand the future, hopefully.
All right. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Really.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.